Welcome to the Writing Biz. Today I have Lee Pound as my guest. Lee Pound is an author, speaker, and business coach who transitioned from a career as a newspaper editor and corporate chief financial officer to becoming a mentor for writers. Trained by the legendary publisher Sol Stein, Lee specializes in helping authors and entrepreneurs use storytelling to build authority, grow their businesses, and navigate the complexities of the publishing world. Hi, Lee. How are you today? I'm so glad that you could make it.
Hello, I really appreciate you having me on your show.
I think that this will be a very interesting show with all the experience that you have and the other interests that you have. You spent a few years learning from Sol Stein. Could you tell me a little bit about that? And what do you think is the most impactful lesson you learned from him that helps you with the business of storytelling that maybe other authors might overlook?
Well, I've always been into storytelling, and I was at some point back, however many years ago it was, I was starting to write novels. I'd always been interested in writing a novel. I didn't know anything about how to do it, but I had started writing one and I actually wrote a full one. And what do I do now was my question. So I'm sitting in my office and I get a email from the University of California, Irvine. And they said, Sol Stein is coming out to teach a course on dialogue. And I thought, oh, okay, we get courses all the time. Look back at my bookshelf and I see all sorts of books with Stein and Day on them and said, I got to go. And so I did. I signed up. And it was a great course. It was about 6 weeks. He talked all about dialogue. There were 50 people in the classroom. So here's where it got interesting. At the end of it, everybody said, well, this is so great. What do we do now? So he said, and this is sometimes you just got to take advantage of these things and see what happens. He said, okay, I'm going to create a small workshop for readers, maybe for writers, maybe 10 or 15 people at most out of this audience of 50. He said, send
Wow.
me your first 2 pages and I'll let you know if you're in or out.
Wow, that's incredible.
Yeah. So I sent my 2 pages and I got a letter back saying, you're in. So I spent
That's
4
wonderful.
years, about 10 weeks every summer for 4 years in this small group with Sol Stein sitting there at the head of the table. And I wrote 3 novels while I was there. And he was very strict. He knew what he was talking about, but he was also very interesting, a funny guy at times. One of these people, he just wanted to see you do well. So
That's a
I
great
wrote,
gift right there.
yeah, but he was not above telling you you're a mess. So the second year, I did this really funny, rollicking type of thing that sounded fun. I turned in the first few chapters to him at the beginning. And week went by, 2 weeks went by as we met. I didn't hear a word. Finally, I asked him, did you get my manuscript? And he said, yes. And then he said, there were so many green marks on it. He wrote, edited in green, that I didn't even want to give it back to you. So I said, okay, that one's not going to work. And I said, okay, I'll go back and do something else. And I went back and I had this idea for doing something about an archaeologist out in the California desert who makes a huge strike, find, and gets famous. And so I wrote, and I did it in first person, but first person, multiple persons, and that's unusual.
Yep.
So I wrote it and I said, this is either going to fly or not. And so I gave it to him and waited the week and came back and sat down and he looked at me and he said, actually to the entire group. He said, I picked this up and I read it. And he said, it was so good, I almost fell out of my chair.
Oh, that's wonderful.
I thought, okay, I'm doing something right. So I spent the rest of that year finishing that novel. And I came back the next year and we did some more work. And it was one of those revelation periods. You have in front of you one of the most famous publishers of the 20th century. And he's a guy at the end of the table telling you what to do. Almost nobody gets that experience.
Oh,
And I took it and ran with it. So I rewrote the novel, and it's actually out there on ebook somewhere, several places, but I need to get it out there in another way. But the key is I learned some deep secrets that later, when I partnered with my other writing partner, Jim Terrell, we started a class called Write Your Book a Weekend. We literally had a class and they walked in and walked out with a book over the weekend. It's a first draft, but it's a start. So we were teaching storytelling and structure and all of that sort of thing. And I learned a lot of that from Sol.
that's amazing that you had that opportunity because that really cuts to the chase of good writing as
Yeah,
opposed to just figuring it out on your own through trial and error and having to go through all that to be able to take an opportunity with somebody with that kind of knowledge.
I,
I tell people all the time, if you get a chance to take a course
exactly.
because
Any course,
even if you get one thing out of it, one single thing, it was worth the money because
it's,
it'll help you be a better writer or whatever you're trying to do.
yeah, that's what I found. These things have repercussions too, because interestingly enough, about the third year, somewhere in the middle, one of the guys in the group decided to get married. So, of course, he invited all of us in the group. And believe it or not, we went to the wedding and we did the whole thing. I went out and I caught the garter, believe it or not. And this woman who had walked over to me and said, guess what? I got the garter. She said, I got the bouquet. Let's talk. And she became my second wife.
Oh my goodness. That's adorable.
Yeah. So, all these things seem to move as long as you take the right steps and dive into something you don't know is going to happen or what's going to come of it. In a lot of cases, great things come. And so I got out of the Sol Stein thing such an immense part of, amount of work and amount of people that I met and so forth. He passed away about 10 years
Right.
ago.
But the others in the group, do you have any that you stay in contact with?
I haven't had too much contact with most of them, and I haven't found out that they actually published anything. But I did. And so this sort of thing was incredible. But then there's the marketing aspect. I wasn't much into marketing, but as I was going along, this is where the whole genealogy thing comes in. I early on decided I wanted to be a genealogist. I wanted to find out family history. And what really got me going was I asked my mom what her grandfather's name was. And she looked at me and she said, Grandpa. And so I had to
Right.
go figure it out. And I got into DNA and all of that sort of thing. I wanted to find my German ancestors and went to Germany and actually found them in a little town in Germany, believe it or not. And I came back and yeah, okay, this is a fine thing. And I was in the Genealogy Society and they said, oh, would you like to give a talk about how you found your ancestors at our event. It's an hour long. I had never given a speech before. I hadn't even thought about giving one. And I said, sure, no problem. So I gave my hour-long talk on how we found the Germans. Somebody walked up to me and said, hey, my society would like to hear that. It set off about a 20-year speaking career on genealogy. So I learned how to
Fascinating.
speak. And my wife had gone to school in Mexico, and she heard about this big event in Mexico at the university, like the MIT of Mexico. She called down there and said, hey, can I speak? She spoke on Spanish things and stuff like that. And then she said, can my husband speak? And I spoke on business. So I went there and we figured, okay, this is a little bitty thing. There's nothing much going to be there. And then we looked at on the internet at the hall where it was going to be. And it's one of those halls that goes way up and back. I thought, oh, we're getting into something big. It turned out it was the 15th annual business seminar at Tec de Monterrey in Monterrey, Mexico. I followed the guy who lost the race for president of Mexico. I had never given an hour-long speech on any subject of genealogy in front of this huge audience, following the mayor, to almost the president of Mexico. And I said, okay, I like this speaking thing. Ended up doing Speak Your Way to Wealth, which was a major seminar on speaking skills with a partner. All of these things come together in ways that you can't tell. But if you follow your passions and follow your interests and take a step out there, step off the edge sometimes. And writing to me is like that. So many people want to know exactly how to write. When my partner and I put together the workshop, we said, hey, come to our weekend workshop live. And about 15, 20 people showed up. One of them said, I'm scared to death of writing. I can't do it. I don't know what I'm doing. Others said, we know what we're doing, but we got no idea where to start. And we had this workshop where we guided them through step by step. They had 5 minutes to do something, and then they go to the next thing. And the end result was a first draft. So we did this workshop, and we had people coming in. One said, I never write. I don't like writing. I can't write. He walked out with the first draft. And
Can't
that
say he's got a lot of courage to take a writing course.
it would take a lot of courage, but we had 12 people sitting in the room, and we went through step by step by step over 2 days. Every one of them walked out with the first draft.
Well, that's amazing because it's not an easy job to do, but
It's not
you must have a very good plan to be able to execute that.
exactly. And then my partner is a minister, and they were having a big ministers conference. He said, let's put up a booth to sell the speaking seminar. And I said, sure, we'll do that. And we did it. We set it up. So when I'm there, the first day, about halfway through, this woman walks up to the table. And she's all
Don't tell me
dressed.
you married her too.
Yeah. And she said, hi, I'm Diana. I'm writing a book. And I said, you've come to the right place. And so we got her into the seminar. She did it. She came down and talked to me. We talked a little bit. End of story. She became my third wife. You just never know.
That's amazing.
And she's written a
You
book.
never know. Wow, that's something else. You still do speaking? Do you still go out there?
I don't do too much of it anymore, but I've done some podcasts and I do a lot of stuff. I could go out there and do it again, but I just have been concentrating on working with book clients now, helping them write
Right.
their book.
When you work with a client, what kind of services do you offer them? And I'm also interested to know is how your background as a CFO influences your work with your clients?
I think, first of all, the CFO thing was in and out, not just CFO, but of a public corporation. It gave me a lot of work on details. You had to do the 10 Qs and 10 Ks and all of that just exactly right, and work with these big auditors and all of that. And so I got a really strong background in accounting. I've actually used it by doing all the accounting for my church now. And Jim, who was my partner in the writing group. So all of these things come together. And I think the key with the business experience was that realizing that writing is not a hobby, it's a business. And I learned so much about marketing, how you target your book, how you find the right audience. And so that's one thing that I work with all of my clients on. So the business aspects of writing are you have to get your book out there. You can't just write it and they will come. You have to market, and you have to know how to create an audience, and you have to know how to tailor your book to a certain audience. And I find that if the writer doesn't know anything about business and they're just sitting there waiting for the audience to come, you put it up on Amazon and say, okay, where's the 1,000 books sold? Maybe they sell one or two or three. Well, they never told anybody.
Right. Well, it's building that foundation. And I mean, like knowing that you have to start building your audience when you have an idea for a book instead of waiting until you're ready to turn it over to a publisher. And now you don't have an audience to sell a book. Publishers, honestly, especially if they're an indie publisher, expect you to have some type of your own base to market to. So it's just so important for authors to gain those marketing skills and to understand that the business aspects of the book are just as important as the words they're putting on the page if they want to be a successful author.
Yeah, that is so true because the successful author is out there pushing the book. They're doing book signings, they're traveling, they're doing all sorts of things. And of course, they have to have the right book too. And you have to know which audience is going to go for your book. And if you become known in one particular area, say like mystery or say like horror or stuff like that, you keep writing in that area and build your audience. You don't go write in some other area and do a novel on this and do a novel on something totally different because you'll be writing to two different audiences. And that
Yeah.
does not work.
No, you're spreading yourself too thin instead of concentrating on one direction. I'm a fantasy author, so I read a lot of fantasy authors and I pay attention to a lot of fantasy authors online because while I'm still working on my series, eventually I'd like to get it out there. And so besides doing the podcast, which of course is separate from that, I have
Mm,
to work on building that other audience as well. That it's not easy, and I completely understand the difficulties that authors face. One is the technology.
mhm.
If they don't understand the technology, because so many tools that we use today are online and require some type of technical savvy, even if it's just a little bit. And then also understanding the mechanism of marketing, how to structure things. I was in sales for a really long time
Mm,
and businesses for people. The last one I ran was a huge nightclub. So having a big nightclub like that, there's an incredible amount of marketing and things that you have to do to get people in the door. I mean, it's not easy to get 400 people in the door every Friday and Saturday night if you're not marketing. So I had all that background. And so I understand business probably better than I understand writing. I'm sure I understand business better than writing. People who have paid attention to what my podcast is and the way I'm getting information out, and there, it's obvious that I had a plan and I
mm.
followed through the plan. to do that. And that's difficult for somebody who doesn't have that knowledge, and they need guidance from people like you that can help show them the way. Because if not, they end up with a terrific book that doesn't get to see the light of day.
Well, I had an extreme example of that just recently. I had one client, new client, come in, and I saw the first draft of the book, and I'm not going to go into the details on the book because it's still being written. But she literally had her whole attention on exactly the wrong place and didn't know how to tell a story and didn't know how to actually write. She knew how to write a good sentence, but there was too much there that just wasn't there yet. And I ended up having to say, go back and just start over, use the template I have. We called it PCOR. What is the problem that the authors are facing? This works in nonfiction and fiction. What's the problem? And then you go to what's the inciting incident, the issue with that problem? And then you have C, which is the interior, the part where you go through and you actually resolve the problem. And then O is the opportunity. What's going on? Are you coming to an end? Well, how is it going to work? And then R is the resolution. Does the author win in fiction? Does the character lose? All of that. And when you look at it, that is a story. That's the story structure. If you use story structure in a nonfiction book, you will write an amazing book. What's the problem? Well, people in business don't know how to do this. What's the issue? They are not hiring the right people or something like that. What's the C? What's the opportunity? How can you change it? What's the resolution? And it's how you come out right. People can use it to build a business. People can use it to write nonfiction. And it just works. But I am first and foremost a storyteller because I believe that story is at the bottom of every good book. One of the most famous business books out there, I forget who the author was at this point, was about half an inch thick, quarter of an inch thick, and it was a story. And yet it took people through the process of building a business, and it sold millions of copies.
I don't know if you've ever read any of Ziegler's books, but he was an amazing storyteller and a communicator. And it just makes all the difference. You get so invested in the book and you could see the possibilities in your head because he was able to communicate that well. I love writers like that. Whether nonfiction or fiction, I love it when they just make me go, wow, this is so interesting.
And one of the things that people leave out of their books so much are stories. I remember one story one of the authors wrote in one of his books, and it was about the idea that you can't be careful what you're looking for and what you get. And he said, here's just real quick, here's how it went. This couple was taking care of a little dog for some friends. And for some reason or other, the dog died. They said, what do we do? And they said, well, take the dog to the vet. So they had this little box, put the dog in it, and got on the subway to go to the vet. And as they're going down, some character comes running along and grabs this box and runs off the train. And he said, guess what happens when he opens that box and thinking he's gotten $1,000 or something? He's got a dead dog. So he used that story to tell a whole message. And if you don't put stories in your books, they're just boring. They're dull.
I agree. If you're writing an article, if whatever you're doing, there has to be some story to it, or you're just regurgitating facts, then that's not interesting.
Exactly.
You've mentioned that you help authors with their branding. Am I correct about that?
You see,
How would go
if,
ahead?
if you're an author, you're looking for an audience. But how do people find an author that fits their needs? And therefore, you have to brand yourself in some way. Some authors have become novelists have become the mystery queen. Others have a series that goes in a specific step by step way. And like the Harry Potter stuff, for instance, it's just a story, but it has a very specific process and procedure, and it works. So the important thing that I've found in getting your message out there is that you have to start with some kind of here's what I am about. Here's what you're going to get out of me. And then you brand yourself in that area. And if you try to do something out of that area, a lot of times, particularly authors, they write mysteries forever, very successfully. Try to write something else. Well, okay, I'm going to write a science fiction book. And it just is dead because they're branded as a mystery writer. And if you can brand yourself, it's amazing how much you can get into your real target audience.
Yeah, I absolutely agree with you about that. It's always been really important to me. I was fortunate to work with a couple for many years in 5 or 6 of their businesses, and the husband was an extremely creative, person. He taught me a lot about branding and how to, be sure that it's consistent and all the different nuances of building a marketable brand. But like I said, that earlier, for a new author or someone just starting out, it's hard to understand those processes. Luckily, today, we have access to a lot more information than we did 15, 20 years ago when you're trying to figure out how to get your book out into the public and how to get an audience. The access is easier. Of course, it's flooded. There,
Exactly. It certainly is. And the more you tailor yourself to a certain audience, there's plenty of people out there to become a bestseller if you're right in there and you get your audience going. But you can't be a generalist anymore. It just doesn't
no,
work.
no, you definitely have to have a niche to follow, a lane to stay in. Another facet of your life is genealogy, and I would love to know more about how that's impacted your life and how you got started and how that fits into the storytelling that you love so much.
Well, I got started. It was just a matter of curiosity about my own family. And I told you the bit about my mom and her grandfather. Well, you know, he was grandpa, but I went back and discovered that he was actually a drummer boy in the Civil War. And he had a fascinating life after that. So all of a sudden there was this person instead of just a name. And a lot of people in genealogy just go after names and places. But I like to find out a little bit about who the person was. Did they own land? Were they a pioneer? Did they get into the wars? Did they, you get back to early New England, you can have ancestors 5 or 6 on the Mayflower, and you can start go look into that and see what was it really like to be on that boat. And it wasn't easy. Those
No,
huge problems to even get there, they almost split apart before they even left.
my family came from England. The
Mhm.
decision to make that trip was not like an overnight decision. It was a couple of years at least. It was difficult making the decision and getting to the point to where they had a ship they could get on to come to America. It's really fascinating to me that they spent so much time building up this, like in my family situation, they built a community. They were Puritans. They built a community,
Mhm.
and with their preacher, they moved to America just outside of Salem, Massachusetts.
Yeah,
When the ship came to America, they built a town.
I was fascinated to find my dad has a real split. Hey, he's half north and half south. The south part came from Virginia. The north part was primarily New York, New Jersey, and New England. And so we've got a lot of famous names in the early settlers among my ancestors. So there's stories and stories, but I found the most stories fascinating were the ones afterwards of the people who, the third generation that went out west into the woods and fought for land and built a homestead and started building up and started a family. And in the end, they created a whole town.
Strength of character and courage that it takes to do something like that is it's very inspiring.
It's extremely inspiring. And then I was thinking about there was the whole trek from in the 30s with the Dust Bowl from Oklahoma to California. And I hadn't thought too much about what that must have been like until we drove over the route that a lot of them took. There's a couple of museums, and there was a museum that had one of these old 1930s cars. And you look at that thing and you think, how on earth could they have gone up these mountains and across these deserts in that thing and survived? And yet they did. And it's an incredible story. I always wanted to put a story to as many of the ancestors as I could. Who actually were they? What did they do? And of course, as you get into it, and here's the thing I discovered pretty quickly, especially on early records and a lot of the stuff that was written, there are a lot of errors. There's a lot of people who have created whole genealogies, whole pedigrees out of thin air. And I had been fighting hard to find one of my grandmother's ancestral families, which is the Hardings, and they're in Eastern Virginia. And I got back in there, and there was a whole thing written 100 years ago about the Hardings of Northumberland. And it had this whole family built that there were four sons. They each all had families. And I was buying into that and also they had an ancestry in England, and I blew that one apart really quickly. But I got into it, and all of a sudden I realized I better start looking at the DNA on all these families. And there's the Hardings have a great site where each group is split by DNA.
Interesting.
Yeah. And so I looked at it and I was expecting them to be, because of the way they were talking, all of them in the same place. And they weren't. They were separate haplogroups, which is a totally separate lineage. And this
Oh.
four-person family that has been written up so many times over the decades was incorrect. And I studied further and further, and I kept finding more. Not only was it incorrect, instead of having 4 children. This couple only had one that had any descendants. And meanwhile, everybody else is tying off of them. There were 3 separate families, and thought, oh my gosh. And so I actually wrote a book on that. And then I learned some more information and went back and rewrote it. It's about 400 pages. And it is a complete refutation of the old system and what the new group is and how they all connect together. And it has a number of things nobody's ever published before.
Oh, very interesting.
Yeah, but it took detailed research. The records are available, but in genealogy, you cannot take anybody's word for it.
No, you have to find some proof. I mean, when I was going through my family's genealogy, that was very important to me that I had the actual marriage records and the birth records, because the further back you get, the resources become harder to find. I was lucky in that my family in England was a very well known family. So there was more information about them. I don't want to get into it too much because it would take all the rest of the evening, but there's so much information about them that I had to weed through and make sure that I was going in the right direction. I had a glitch at one point because one of my ancestors became the ward of this very famous lord. Well, that caused a glitch because I couldn't understand how he became a ward. And it took me like a year to figure this out and to make sure that I was still on the right track, that I wasn't, taking a turn one way or the other off the path and getting into the weeds where I
It,
didn't want to be. But I was able to figure it out. But it is
it
a
is.
lot.
Sometimes you come up with things you didn't expect to find. Everybody I come in contact with, I have their DNA done. So my wife, I did hers pretty early, and her family is half from the Azerbaijan area near South Russia, actually, where Iran, Turkey, and all those come together. And they came out across the plains of Russia right after World War II, practically walking the whole way with 2 babies to get to America. And then they had a German component. Now, how does somebody from there get a German? Well, the Catherine the Great in the 1700s said, I'm opening up the agriculture out in the east. The Germans were trying to find a place to go. She got a whole bunch of Germans to go over to the Volga River. And so there were the Volga Germans. And it turns out that she is descended from these Volga Germans. She has a Weber in the background from a certain part of Germany, and I have a Weber in the background, and we actually showed a DNA connection going back in the 1700s. So you just never know. But the other thing was, after I did it, we looked at it, and she was on the phone with her mother and saying, oh, we know here's Aunt this and Uncle that, my brother and my uncle and all of those. And I pointed out one of them and I said, who's this Joanne? And she looked at me and said, I don't know. Yes, Mom, I don't know. Well, guess what? Dad did a little bit of, shall we say, philandering in his high school years and left a kid who went back to New York.
It's amazing the things you find out because, like, when I was growing up, my mother's parents had told me, but little bits and pieces. But you're a kid, you're young, you're not really paying attention. And to go back and see that the little things that I remembered were actually even more than what I understood. For example, I have a family member who was the minister that married Abraham Lincoln and Mary Todd and
Hmm.
sold them their first house in Springfield. But like I understood there was some connection with Lincoln, but I didn't understand what it was. There have been a lot of people that have done genealogies on the lines of my family, so there was a lot of information. And when I got into the 1600s or 1500s, it started to get, sparser. And I was still able to find things because the churches are still there that they had the marriage records. It's absolutely fascinating to me.
Yeah, it is. I discovered that the early Pound families were all Quakers, and that makes a very different situation because they don't like to marry outside of Quakerism and all of that.
Right.
I went up and visited one branch in Canada. One of the guys went up there and had like 10 or 12 children. They were all Quakers. They all intermarried. And so you have all of these cases where there's one woman who, how did it go? Her mother was a relative, her grandmother was from the same branch, a different branch. And you went back and it all just collapsed into about 5 people when you got back 4 generations.
Yeah,
Because
you have to really like to be somebody who likes to pull a thread.
one of the things I learned really quickly was that you can't rely on the published records. And remember the thing that I found that had been published 100 years ago that was totally wrong.
Right.
Everybody he did 3 books were written using all of that info. And I had to essentially go back and say, everything you thought about this family is wrong. But it's fascinating to discover that. I got involved in a group that was studying a particular family that came out of Virginia. And it was interesting because we were starting to do DNA. And it appeared that, trying to remember what exactly the name is now, but every time we got to finding people with this name, we found people who were Hardings. We were trying to figure out how on earth can all of this fit together. And it turns out that when you go back far enough, there were two born to 2 different people, and one was a Harding and one was, wish I could think of the name right now. But at any rate, I had been trying to find my William Harding and I'd been trying to find a Joseph. And it turns out that they were descendants of this other family through non-marriage relationships. Looking,
Fascinating.
looking and trying to figure it out, and nothing made sense and nothing added up. And all of a sudden, oh, the DNA says they go back to this one. So I added that. I did a whole 400-page book and I added that in.
I was given a book when my mother passed away that was the genealogy of my grandfather's family. And it didn't go back as far as I've taken it back. But one reason I was able to do that when this was compiled, the DNA technology wasn't there. Now, if you go back to look at your ancestry, you can see these connections and know that they're correct connections.
Exactly. And sometimes it's interesting to get involved with a group that's working on, say, 1 or 2 of your lines, because all of a sudden you can run into a whole rabbit's nest of weird stuff like we did with these Hardings were not Hardings. They were somebody.
Let me ask, while we're on the subject of historical research, how could a writer who is doing some type of specialized historical research. Bring that in to make profitable income streams.
It's difficult because you have to get something that people are interested in, but you also have to have a platform to get out there and do it. You have to do interviews, you have to do all sorts of things. But if you can go back and find a historical event that wasn't what most people think it is, you can actually get a book published on it. You can actually do well because you can go out and speak on it. And speaking is one of the best ways to sell books.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
That's why speaking and writing work together. My second wife ended up having pancreatic cancer and passed away.
I'm
And
sorry to hear that.
incredible spiritual experience during I wrote a book on, which is called 9 Days in November. And it's about the last 9 days of her life when some just amazing things happened. I went to speak to the Life After Life Club here in Laguna Woods. And I got 100 people in the audience, and I probably sold 50 books.
Yeah, that's wonderful.
Yeah. And if you have something like that's going to draw an audience, you can go around and speak on it. And the more speaking you do, the better it works. One thing that I got out of it, also out of that particular book, was a whole speaking tour on the subject of the book to Arizona of a major national group. So you just never know. But then people want to know more about you. So if you can get on stages, to me, that's the best way to start reaching a wider audience. And these days, stages include the internet.
Sure.
Stages include programs that you do on the internet. They include podcasts like this. They include doing reels. They include doing whole series. But there's so much more to do now as far as marketing than there used to be. But too often people just don't market themselves right. And if you use speaking and writing, write about your subject, speak about your subject, draw audiences, get people to invite you to go to their audience, you can start
Exactly.
a lot of books.
Use the things in front of you and try to build up some type of personality out of that.
Well, what are you speaking on? You speak on the thing you care the most about
Right.
and the processes you've done and the things that you've learned. And sometimes it's psychological, sometimes it's business, sometimes it could be anything. But the key is the more you do of that and the more audience you draw, the better your books are going to sell and the more speeches you're going to get.
Exactly.
So,
And then also too, it lights a fire under you to
mhm.
continue to write and communicate and build up your own writing business. I know that whenever I go to any kind of event, it fires me up. It lights a fire in me to continue to want to be a part of that. Community's everything.
Speak Your Way to Wealth, for instance, I was talking about writing and selling books. How do you do it? And of course, everybody was interested in that. And I had a program to actually help people write the book. But what ends up happening is you start meeting other people who want to write a book, but they're in another field. And you can get into that field and you can learn more about it and you can write more about it. I always figured that you don't just pick one small thing to write about. You make yourself an expert in a certain area. And there's a lot of things that trail off that expertise. And so I got really good at speaking. I could write about speaking. I got good at genealogy. I wrote a huge book on genealogy. I know a lot about marketing and about writing, and you can make yourself an all around person by doing all of this. It's just incredible how it works.
You're a very good example of how you've taken all these different pieces and built them into a business. So you're not relying on one specific thing. So the whole thing as all these aspects of it create a career that, yeah, you most certainly are proud of and should be proud of. And there were a lot of people along the way that helped, obviously, like Sol Stein, people that you run into that gave you an opportunity or an idea or a push. That's one reason I do this show is because I'm hoping that my
And
guests will have an impact on the audience and get them working on their business.
for instance, I had the luck of working with Sol Stein. He's written a couple of great books on writing people can go get, and that's almost as good as sitting in front of him. But the other key is there are experts in whatever field you're in out there, and you can connect with them. In fact, many of them want to connect with people, and you can
Right.
learn from them, and you can get experience, and just keep reaching out, because if you just try to stay in your own place and just learn stuff by not doing it, I learned so much by getting up on big stages with 100 people in the audience and selling my product.
I call that learning equity. And I think that's the most important equity you can have in any business is the knowledge that you acquire that helps you be better at what you're doing. That is something no one can ever take from you. I spend a lot of time building learning equity. I spend 1 or 2 hours a day learning every day because that's what pushes me forward and pushes me into new things. Today, with all the different things that you have to learn to be able to function, it's a great habit to have.
Here's one that I don't know why I did it. I was in a group that was run by a very experienced salesperson. He was great at selling from the stage. He always sold a lot of product, and I was learning a lot from him. But he was one of our regulars on Speak Your Way to Wealth. And of course, he always sold a lot of products on Speak Your Way to Wealth. And so I'm in the group one day, and he said, "What is your big goal for the end of this year?" And I said, "I'm going to outsell you at the next Speak Your Way to Wealth." Now, given I hadn't really sold very much and I wasn't necessarily that good at it, but I made the challenge and I got up on that stage, and believe it or not, I actually so connected with the audience that I outsold the guy by a couple of
Amazing.
dollars. From there on, every time I showed up, he said, "This is the guy who outsold me." It really builds your energy and your feeling and your confidence when you can do something like that. Set
Certainly.
a task that's impossible and do it. I'll give you an example. My current wife had been trying to write a book for literally decades. Literally. Had all these piles of paper and notes. And then we got together and we wrote a draft, and it wasn't that good. Finally, she just sat down and said, "Okay, I am going to write this book and I'm going to do it right." And she spent 4 or 5 months literally on the computer, writing, rewriting, changing, working on everything she'd learned from me, and ended up with what I think is an incredible book. It's filled with stories. It builds on her spirituality. It brings in a lot of things from other religions, including a lot of spiritual Buddhism and things like that, that all
Interesting.
saying the same thing. But she finally settled down and went to work on it and got it out. And that is, to me, one of the most powerful lessons for any writer and anybody in any field. You can say you're going to do it. You can go to classes. You can work a little bit. I did a chapter. But if you're going to do the writing and you're going to get it to work and you're going to make a living at it, even, you have to sit down and do the hard work of grinding it out page by page by page, story by story by story, going back and reworking, going back and rewriting, adding things, taking things out, making it smooth. And as you do that, you're building your own skills. When you finally get it out there, it's an accomplishment. Then you can go on, you can now market it, and you can do all sorts of things with it. But the fact that she put it together and got it together and took all of these thousands of notes made over years and made a heck of a book out of it, that just shows you what writing can do and how
It's
writing,
lovely to hear so much pride in your voice. Uh,
yeah,
Very
I'm really
cool. That's
proud of
very
her.
sweet. Well, I think we're going to wrap this up. Lee, I
Uh,
really appreciated this. What a great discussion. It's been very interesting, but we've covered a lot of territory. I hope that people have found something that's valuable in this conversation that they can use moving forward. So,
I would hope
so,
so, and that's why I do these.
yeah, that's my motivation too. Thank you so much for coming on the Writing Biz, Lee. You can learn more about Lee at leepound.com, and I'll share socials in the show notes. To learn more about the podcast, visit thewritingbiz.com. Don't forget to hit like, share, and subscribe. And while you're there, sign up on the website to be the first to learn about new episodes. The link will also be in the show notes. Until next time, take what you learned and put it to work in your own writing biz. Thank you, Lee.
You're welcome.